Let's go ahead and open the March 11th Planning Commission meeting. And first item on the agenda is agenda changes. Does anyone have agenda changes?
I wanted to talk a little bit about the project that's up at the Richmond Road intersection where the trailer park is and so forth.
About
about that project that's starting with, I think, Alex, that you have made an arrangement with a consultant to work on that. Du Bois and King.
So how about under other business?
An update on,
yeah, let's do that
under
other business. That would be great. And that would fit in perfectly, actually.
Good.
Any other agenda changes? Okay. Second item is public comment for non-agenda items, and once again, no public, no comments. So now we're into architectural and streetscape design standards, and I guess so you included some changes to what we've already discussed, and then you have some new items. And
so what I've been doing, this is draft 3. So in each of these iterations, I'm taking just a chunk of what I've had time to draft. You discuss it, tell me how you want it changed, and at the next meeting, I draft additional chunks and then make the revisions to the prior ones that you indicated. So this draft. Changes were made to standards 1 through 4 based on the discussion at your last meeting, and then I went ahead and did a new language. And totally at your discretion how you want to proceed. My hope was that you would continue to focus on the new stuff.
Yeah, let's
do
that.
When we hopefully get to the end of it at the next meeting, I'm anticipating we'll be through all of them at your next meeting. Then we can take a more comprehensive look back and say, you know, based on everything, does it gel? But if you've got a concern about a revision that was made to what based on last meeting, you could also let me know. And
I think pushing forward and continuing to tackle the new stuff, and then we can go back, as you said, when we're all done, and look at it all as a new set of regulations. Okay, so that leads us to building. So
yeah, there were only 2 new standards, language for 2 new standards. One was number 5, architectural variety. That's where the bulk of my work was over the last couple weeks. And then Rolf actually provided some language that I adapted for standard number 6, building height relief for taller buildings. So if you want to dive into architectural variety, I've broken it down into categories: building form, corporate branding, building material, building height, and roof lines and pitch. And that's starts on page 3 of the draft.
I wondered if I feel like I've heard from the Energy Committee wanting to have some language about, you know, solar orientation, and I wonder if maybe we should ask them for some input on this section. I mean, I guess I'm worried about mandating that some buildings aren't going to face the same way if, say, a builder comes in and wants to have all the buildings to capitalize on solar gain or solar panel on the roofs.
There's definitely a tension there, and that came up at the Haystack Crossing review at their last meeting, because the Energy Committee previously and now, I think, has concerns about how that project is laid out, and that was one of the arguments that the developer made was, you know, we would like to have the ability to have some variety of architectural style and building orientation rather than to have it all look just sort of cookie cutter. So yeah, there's definitely tension there between those two things. And you're right, this language doesn't speak to solar aspect at all. We have other language in the regulations that does speak to that, but it's largely interpreted to mean that lots should be arranged in such a way to make that possible, not that buildings themselves be oriented in a specific way. Whereas this section is very much about building specificity.
Do you think that it's appropriate to have it in this section in terms of orientation?
It's a good question.
As opposed to the energy,
Yeah,
or something else?
I'm not sure. I part of me thinks that issue is significant town-wide, and therefore if we're going to mandate that buildings have a southern exposure or have a certain orientation for solar gain, why would we limit that to just the village area? Like, these regulations are designed just to be specific to the village growth area. So part of me thinks that if that's an important step in the regulatory purview of the town, we ought to do it town-wide and say, anywhere you build a house, we're going to tell you, that it has to be oriented a certain way. Because I'm not sure that it's not something specific to the village, whereas the rest of these things really are, because it's such a dense, or envisioned to be a much more densely settled part of the town.
I think that makes sense, to deal with all of the buildings in town. And it doesn't have to be a rigid requirement anywhere. My own personal experience, that's how I get my electricity, all from solar. You can be 20 degrees either side of directly south, and you do just fine. It doesn't have to be, it has to be oriented this way. And talk about the long axis of the building. It's not just solar panels on the roofs, it's the light that comes in on the south side, it's the warmth that comes in through the windows on the south side. So there's a reason to have the long length of the building running more or less east and west. It just makes sense, physically, to my mind.
I've got a related comment. Maybe some of you have noticed a home in a neighboring neighborhood that has solar panels across the small front yard to the point where you can't even see the house. Like, just the whole front yard covered with solar panels. And is that something that we want to see in Hinesburg, and should it be addressed in these regulations? Because when I drive by this particular house, I'm like, I think, what an eyesore. And sure, there's something to be said for getting energy from the sun, but meanwhile, I would personally rather see it on a roof line where it's not your front yard.
Yeah, so the difficulty in regulating that is that we don't have regulatory authority over renewable energy installations that are connected to the grid. So the solar panels that people put on their roofs, or the fixed solar that they put out in their yard, we are prohibited from regulating that. So I'm not sure that if we included a design standard relative to solar, that we would be on solid legal ground.
Could be a sticky situation.
Yeah, I don't think that would hold up.
What's the prohibition actually say?
It says that that kind of development is regulated by the Public Utility Commission at the state level, and therefore local zoning doesn't apply.
If you install a solar panel and it's connected to the grid, the state has
They have jurisdiction over it. Yep. And our regulations, the state law allows us to adopt screening provisions for solar, as long as they also are similarly applied to other types of commercial uses. And we went through this process at Len Duffy's suggestion to add that. We don't enforce those screening provisions, but if they're in our regulations, the Public Utility Commission can, for projects that are large enough to generate a real review by then. by
If they're
them.
in our regulations, then the public facilities.
Then the Public Utility
committees
Commission
can use
will
our regulations
we'll look at
to
them
bring
and
it
consider
to-
them in terms of a larger application. Most of these residential solar applications are too small to ever even generate a Public Utility Commission hearing. They just, there's a very easy way that they get approved. And so there's no one looking at screening provisions per se for these smaller installations. But that's just all by way of saying, I don't think we have regulatory jurisdiction over solar, not net metered solar. And that's the only kind there really is, or connected to the grid. Very few people have off-grid solar installations, with some exceptions.
You've got a large representation compared to the committee size. 1 out of 9.
Certainly in the village,
off
there
the grid.
there won't be anybody off the grid, for sure.
So I was just checking the town plan on, for the energy goals, and there is, explore amending zoning and subdivision regulations to include design standards to preserve the southern exposure of buildings for passive and active solar gain. Balance this with other siting and design factors, especially in the village growth area where compact development is more common and street trees are necessary.
That's the tension.
Yeah, that
it's
is the
both
tension.
wanting to have architectural varieties so that it looks like a real place and an attractive streetscape, and it's also wanting to have things that might get in the way, might shade solar, like street trees.
Is part of, I don't want to pull it up, but hasn't BlackRock, don't they have a large solar field as part of their proposal?
Yeah,
And-
there's
Only
still
sort
a
of.
field, but it's not very.
Only sort of, sounds
big.
pretty precise.
Yeah, so in their sketch plan design, they had potentially a very large solar array on the western side of the project, well outside of where their real development footprint was, to the west of the rec fields. They decided not to do that, so that's not happening. And instead, now they're proposing a much smaller solar array on the southern part of the site within the developed area, around the new well that they gave to the town, that hopefully will be added to our water supply. Since they can't have houses within a certain distance of that well, it's essentially useless space for them. So in their current plans, they show a small array of solar panels in that location, and they believe that that's an acceptable use in proximity to the well. They're still actually
I was just, I wonder if that would be some way of, balancing that tension is requiring some sort of a, solar field or something to balance
if some houses don't have
with
the
it, yeah, right in
don't
the,
have the right or really good solar passive solar access. Perhaps.
That's part of their current phase.
It is.
Their first phase.
Yep.
That area.
Yep.
I guess the question is, do we want to do that as part of this, and that was as part of the design standards, so it seems like something we should.
Yeah, I think
pick up
that
at this
James is
point.
bringing it up in the right time. Building form, that section talks about this orientation and ensuring there's some variety there, but is silent on that question. So it might make sense to tackle it head on. Yeah.
Has that idea been discussed with the Energy Committee, that it might be addressed in these design standards that we're working on, or
No.
joined together?
No,
There's
no.
not
So
been a
your
discussion
suggestion to
about
reach
that.
out to them
This is new.
would be a good one if the commission feels like you want to go there. I mean, if you don't want to go there and you want these architectural variety standards to be based on aesthetics and other types of function, not solar gain, then maybe we don't need to wrap them in. But if you'd like to go there, it makes sense to reach out to them, because they're wrestling with that right now in their responses to the Haystack project. So it's at the front of their mind.
think
it's,
it'd be interesting to hear from them.
yeah,
Okay.
I
Yeah.
think and this is certainly the right time to do that.
It's a quandary, you know.
Yeah.
It's like any of these things, especially this built form business. You know, you read that stuff, and you sort of look up and down our existing historic streets, and you see all sorts of repetition of built form, you know, and you see variety. But you got a bunch of Italianate buildings. I think there are 3 or 4 in a row. Maybe they're interrupted by something else.
But
They're
they
ta-
make an, they
yeah.
make an impression.
They're Italianate, but they're not identical. They're not.
They're not identical, but say when you're talking here about 70% of the road frontage, so, you know, I mean, I understand what we're trying to do. Whenever you start reading the actual rule and you look around you at what you admire in your town in the first place, then they don't always match up. That's all I'm saying, you know.
Yeah, I feel like I have a very hard time reading the information and
Translating
Ex-
that
Right.
into-
figuring out
into
what
reality.
that'll.
Yeah, will that be the recipe, you know?
Right.
Because I know for myself, you know, I know what I like, but I also know how hard it is to write something
That gets there.
that gets you there, you know.
I've been having extreme difficulty. I am both enjoying the creative exercise of like, oh, what do we like and how, and I'm having a very not fun time turning that into words, you know.
Yeah.
So it's very hard because the same thing. Look down the street and our current village, you think is the template, right? But it doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't work in some respects when it comes to new development, and it's hard to replicate. And there are always exceptions. Seems like there's always exceptions through. That is one thing that I wanted to discuss with you at some point, maybe at the next meeting when we have this thing all drafted, at least together, is that in some areas in the regs, we grant the DRB waiver power to say, you know, these are standards, but the DRB has the power to waive them as long as there's a good reason and the solution doesn't violate the intent of these standards, meaning an individual standard can be bent or broken, but you know the spirit of it can't be. And I think that it would make sense to use similar waiver language in this whole section for those reasons, you know. But anytime you do that, you wonder whether you've just opened up a Pandora's box to let everybody just get out of jail free card kind of a thing.
You do, but it's also, it's just impossible looking at words to come up with every single scenario,
Right.
every single.
So let me tell you what these words mean, since I spent time on them. The building form section is the first sentence explains what it's trying to do, right? There shall be a variety of building form and orientation along the road frontage. And it's as simple as that. What these bullets try to achieve is first, let's look at the orientation of your building. And I'm not an architect like the two of you are, so it's hard for me to describe it in words that an architect would understand and use. But for me, I think of the simplest house with a pitched roof, and so it has a central roof line, and the roof comes down evenly on either side of it. The house you draw when you're a kid. For house, it's a monopoly house, right? So well, actually maybe not. I think those are hip roof. But anyways, so for that kind of a house, you have a gable end, which is the end that looks like a triangle. At least the roof portion of it looks like a triangle. And then you have the non-gable end, which is where the roof comes down, and that's the other side of the house. And you look down our street in the village here, and some houses are oriented to the street with their gable end facing the street. Others are turned so that it's the other way around. And the others have sort of an L shape, and it's a little bit of a mishmash. All this first bullet is saying is that if in that most simple situation, just for an example, we wouldn't allow one of those orientations to be to represent more than 70% of the buildings on the street. So if you're building out a neighborhood and you're doing, okay, I'm going to put my front door in my gable end and I'm going to face it to the street, and the long dimension of my house is going to step backwards. you're gonna build 10 houses on the street, well, you can do 7 like that, but the last 3, you gotta turn them a different way. Or vice versa.
It wouldn't even be an issue if villages, if our village continued to grow organically, one house at a time. But it's because developers come in and want to build 80 houses at one time, and they only want to use 3 different.
It's partially that. It's
models.
also partially the nature of modern day subdivision. So it's not just about wanting to build a limited number of house designs and house orientations to the street, but it's platting out a whole mess of lots and then having those lots dictate which way the house has to face because of the dimensions of the lot. If you create a lot with minimum frontage but long depth, your house is going to be oriented with the narrow dimension facing the road and the deeper, longer dimension, with the long dimension of the lot. And that tends to favor a gable end on a simple house facing the road.
Doesn't that come back to where the orientation is applied? If the development has to recognize that their lots need to accommodate a long axis east-west, then the lots need to be laid out that way, which means the streets need to be laid out that way and so forth. So there's a deeper, more comprehensive requirement for the developer and their land planners to do that at that level. And then the placement of the houses sort of follows from that.
Yep, and
rather than controlling it at the level of the house, control it at the level of the lot and the overall development.
Well, that's a good point, John, is that these design standards are intended to be specific to a building permit.
Yeah.
So we want to be able to tell builder A who walks into the door to the zoning office and says, here's the plan for my house. We want to be able to look at them and say, I have 12 design standards and you meet 10 of them, you better fix these 2. And you're saying we should take a step back and fix it at
I mean, based on what we've talked about, this is something that developers build 30 houses at one time. They're not asking for a permit for one house, they're asking for 30 houses. So we need to control at that level.
Yeah.
Or we could consider controlling at that level. If I were the dictator, I would control at that level.
Well, so let's figure out what you want the form of those buildings and the streets to look like or not look like, and then figure out the appropriate stage in the game to regulate them. This first section on building form says we want the building orientation to be variable. And 70% is just pulled out of a hat, right? It could be 50-50,
Sure.
It could be whatever. But it's basically saying you can't pick one type of building orientation and fill the whole street with that.
Right, right.
I think the negative example versus the positive ones that you were talking about in the village is a row house, right? Perfectly suitable in, certain urban environments, not so much in the Hinesburg village. To see one, fourplex of townhouses repeated all the way down the street. That would just look odd and not, that's what this is getting at anyways. So the second bullet is not about orientation, but is about form. So the style of the house, the way the house is actually shaped is how I was thinking of it. And that this is saying no more than 2 of those in a row. So if you have a simple style house, and it is, you can put 2 of them in a row, and it says including mirrored versions of the same design.
Along a principal road frontage?
Yep.
Right. So we need to be clear about what a principal road frontage is and whether you want to regulate it that way. The reason I wrote that, use that term, is that there's a good possibility that there will be certain segments of a neighborhood or a development plan that include a road to serve an interior section of housing, that is not part of the streetscape that everyone walks up and down all the time. And I'm thinking of Lyman Meadow.
Or Kelly's Field.
Or Kelly's Field, but especially Lyman Meadow, because there are multiple buildings. It's not my sense that you want to prohibit that kind of a neighborhood from happening, in which you do have a repetition of form all the way through the neighborhood.
Connected form. Like, the buildings are built together, multiple units.
Right, but I mean, even between buildings, they are very much the same, one right after the other.
Yes, that too.
Whereas you might want to prohibit, I thought you would want to prohibit that on 116 or on, a main road through a new neighborhood. You might not want to prohibit it within a private road, insulated sort of piece of a neighborhood. So my thought was, if that was the case, that we should talk about what a principal road frontage is and differentiate it in that way. Maybe you don't agree. Maybe you're thinking, well, we should just prohibit that more than two buildings of the same type from happening anywhere, even on insular private, roads interior to a neighborhood.
Well, so, thinking, well, Village Heights is the same idea. That's a private road.
Correct.
Up there. So move down, you have Thistle Hill, where that wouldn't apply. Those are public roads. Those are not private roads.
Yeah, how we would define a principal road might have a lot to do with public versus private.
But then
might
again,
have more to do with the type of streetscape that it is. Remember how we talked about these like A, B, C, and D streets?
Yeah.
We might want to tie that back to that. But before you get into the weeds of that, think about whether no more than two buildings of an equivalent form is the right thing to go after in the first place, and then whether you want to do it throughout the village or only on sort of major streets.
Those first two bullets, I mean, I think they're worthy of discussion. I think the first bullet is kind of good in that it maybe addresses something that James brought up. Say, for example, you've got a nice little street and you've got 10 houses on that street, and the proper solar orientation in terms of how the roof presents itself is, a particular configuration. So you say, all right, 7 of the houses I'm doing on this 10-house stretch are going to have a roof such that we can plaque a nice solar array on a south-facing roof on any one of those. 3 lose out, but maybe they're configured slightly differently or something. So whether the 70 was just an arbitrary number or not, at least sort of enables you to sort of lean that way, potentially, yet still have some variety. It's the second bullet that, where Mater Christi School is, you guys? You remember the guy Steve Conan makes lights and copper
custom
things.
brass and all that?
He lives in a little Victorian house opposite Mater Christi, and there's maybe a row of 10 late 1800 Victorian cottages right there that people have seriously undertaken to restore.
Right.
All of them present this gable, a porch. They're virtually identical. Itinerant carpenters went through and built those things. And it is not offensive. It's probably one of the most desirable little stretches of street to live in Burlington, and they're all the same, except they're all painted a little differently. They probably porch detailing's a little different. I think that the first bullet maybe dispenses with the need to have the second bullet.
That process, or that result that you just described across from Mater Christi, also happens when manufacturing companies built worker housing.
Yeah.
And
Sheldon,
now,
Vermont.
if you go to, what town? Randolph? One of the towns down south, it's a lovely repetition of these buildings that was built by essentially a developer at one time. But over time now, there are subtle differences that everybody has made.
So if Creekside had been built with just one model, over and over and over again, and just the color of the siding were different.
How would we feel?
How would we feel about that?
Well, probably right when it was finished, we wouldn't
Right,
feel
we
so
wouldn't
good.
like it.
No.
50 years
50
down the
years
line,
later.
we'd think, well, the vinyl would be dripping off, but other than that,
Right.
we'd feel okay.
But remember that the part of the
think-
impetus for having these design standards is not to just be picky. It's to inspire confidence in the community that the development that they will be seeing is something they can take pride in and feel good about. And if it's going to take them 50 years to have pride in it and feel good about it, I think we failed. Like, I understand the long view, but I'm sensitive to the fact that we are delving into detail in these design standards, and I don't think there's a reason to go into all that detail if the ultimate result is a whole lot of cookie cutter, plain vanilla stuff that we hope someday will become interesting once roofs get replaced and windows have to be swapped out.
Yeah,
And
I don't have that confidence at all, and I don't, I think looking back 100 years at, quality construction is at all comparable to what we're looking at today and how houses are built today.
well,
I mean, if it
and
were single,
ornate construction, those
Yeah,
homes near
yeah.
Mount Christie, part of the reason I find them attractive is because of their detailing and the interesting, architectural features.
Yeah.
The people don't build those homes anymore, not in quantities like that, right?
Also, with time, we actually do have a street off of Hayden Hill where there were 4 houses about 30 years ago. They were all exactly the same. And they aren't anymore now. It's not a street in the village, but if you go up there now, you wouldn't. None of them look alike anymore.
Because people have put
change
additions
them.
on and changed
Exactly.
siding.
west
and,
or east?
Hayden Hill West. It's a right-hand turn, and I can't remember the name of the street. But
No.
it's about not quite to the top. The same builder built these 4 houses, and they were sort of affordable, and they were exactly alike. Trust me, because I went through the appeals for all of them when we had a reappraisal. And when they came in, and it was like, whoa, those houses really are all alike. But they're not anymore. People change things.
Well, again, this second bullet, and I'm not married to any of this. I'm just telling you, remember the
done a great job.
purpose.
No, no.
But I think that this second bullet is about trying to replicate that concept of organic growth over time yields diversity.
Yep.
And we're not going to get that organic growth over time as much anymore because of the economies of scale. And in order to try to replicate a little bit of that, don't allow a street to populate with the same building form or just mirror images of that.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that just requiring no more than 2 is actually going to achieve that, because obviously the workaround is, well, sure, I put 2 of the same, 1 different, 2 more of the same, 1 different, 2, and then it sort of looks like what you didn't want anyway, right? But how you write that, I'm having a hard time figuring that out.
So did wasn't the DRB maybe when Creekside was built? Was it the Planning Commission?
DRB.
DRB? Okay, so was that required of Brett to do 3 different models, or was that his choosing?
That was his choosing.
It was,
Yep. The
In
board was
in
Those are
Creekside.
3 different
Yeah,
house types?
3 or 4, I forget, but
I think it was 3, but I'm
took
not,
3 or 4 and then would do mirror images of those, so it was
Yeah.
really more like 6 or there. So yeah, but they're
but we thought of them, I know, when we appraised them.
when you appraised them as just 3.
3 or,
different models.
yeah, or 4, like, I think it was 3, but they were basically pretty much not, that did it.
Yeah, and so this bullet's not gonna get after that so much. It's just within a street, it would prevent a line of row houses or townhouses or single family homes that all have the same form. Again, you could get around this pretty easily by taking essentially the same form and just modifying a piece of it to say listen, you know, this,
I'm gonna put this jet
I
out
moved,
here.
I put a jog on, or I moved the porch off to the side, it's not on the front anymore, and it could still be a similar building form.
So I had a question or a comment also. So it seemed like when you started the discussion, when you were naming places like Lyman Meadows, that's a condo development, not single-family homes.
And
So
the-
it's two different, are we gonna try to?
These would apply to all buildings,
So you're not
regardless of
gonna
ownership
allow a
style.
condo development,
No.
if we did this, then it, or it would,
No, so the way this is worded is, that's why the principal road frontage was included.
Right.
So that if you're a condo development off on your own little private, you know,
Okay.
stub,
yeah,
this standard wouldn't apply to
Okay.
you.
that's my question.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess developers are still doing condo developments, I don't know, I'm sort of out
Well,
of touch.
Grabowski has
Yeah.
in phase two, he has some townhouses, I think.
Yeah, like he did in Creekside, on the end towards
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
Saputo was.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're a little different. His
And they-
current proposal is to have 3 9-plexes, which will be sort of townhouse style up and down units, but each building will have 9 units instead of being just a duplex like the ones he did.
So like 27 total units, you're
Yeah,
saying?
so 3 large buildings that have 9 units in them, all attached.
Okay.
This would be could be a problem for his project, not with regard to those 3 units, but actually behind them, there's a row of small like carriage home lots. And I think there are 7 of those, and they're all, you know, they're all gonna look a lot alike, cause the lots are really constrained. And so this could be problematic potentially.
So if you think of the street, that's fairly new off 116, down near well, it used to be the Fairpoint building, but now it's DR Trimmer Mower. Right along in there where, you know, there's a doggy daycare place. Those buildings that are end of Butler Farms, on the north end of
Oh,
Butler
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Farms.
Okay.
They're
Okay.
cute little carriage, I think you call them
Oh,
carriage.
right.
this-
Yeah,
yeah.
Smaller houses.
They're
Yeah.
smaller houses.
Right, which Dennis maintains cost just as much as the big house.
Well, maybe he's right. He could be right. I don't
Yeah,
know.
right.
But those are all very similar in there. Do you know where?
But they are,
They're different colors.
I've never driven down there. I don't
Yeah,
know
you can
that
see
they,
it.
I don't know that they actually
Do
do
you?
repeat.
I have.
It'd be interesting to drive down and
Yeah.
take a look
Yeah.
at that.
So that's just saying.
But yeah, under these requirements, you couldn't have a row of 6 or 7 houses that all
Right.
look the same, just with different colors and columns. You know.
So we'll have to see. Maybe John will show us the pictures. I think of
bring
them
in
as the same when I
photos,
drive by, except different colors and maybe different siding, but they look pretty similar.
so what do you think about those?
I think they're kind of cute. But I haven't driven down that street. I've
Well,
only
they're-
been whizzing by 116
Yeah, me
and
too.
looking over.
As Ralph said, they're new, so.
They are.
You know, they haven't sort of weathered in
Correct.
to their location.
Yeah.
I find a lot of the stuff on the buildings that are decorative to be sort of marginal
Right.
and, you know, why are you spending all of that money to do that? Kind of, that's my reaction as
Yeah.
an architect. I know
Well,
what
sure,
that
I
takes,
could
and,
see where you'd think that.
You know, it's
Yeah.
crude in a way. That's a
Well, it's
harsh
kind of
statement. but-
fake, or not fake.
Yeah,
but, you
we're
know,
gonna,
oh,
I
we're
mean,
gonna
their
stick
porches,
this
their
here.
porches are 3 feet deep. you know,
Right.
That
Yeah,
kind of thing.
I know. Yeah. So anyway, I'm just mentioning that as it's it's
Well, I keep
Yeah.
thinking of, I mean, my experience is too urban for being a village comment, but I lived in the south end of Boston, which is all row houses, some very palatial, very elaborate, very beautiful, and now restored. But some of them were development areas where a person would buy an entire street and do the same house all along, one after another. Often the owner, the developer, would build one house that's a little nicer and all the rest are the same, and over time, they've changed.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're continuous masonry buildings, and yet there are differences about them now
Yeah,
that people in that environment appreciate.
Right.
Again, it's different than our village.
right.
And I think that if we were to plop down a development of 30 houses and they were all the same, that most of the town would agree that's not necessarily what we want to see. You know, having variety that does mock that organic growth that we're talking about, I think is a good goal, and I think that this is a good attempt at achieving that, what you've got here so far.
There's really not a lot to these two bullets, just so we're clear. I mean, I'm looking at them now saying, that's all that I could come up with? And do the architects in the room have any suggestions about other ways?
Any more than that.
Yeah, I know you two tend to be a little reticent to go too far down the prescription of how you design a building, but I'm still respect your opinion about whether we can improve it.
We're burdened with the circumstance that, wow, we recognize that all these rules get written to sort of, you know, corral errant developers and stuff like that. We, of course, think we're well above these rules, and we don't want to be constrained in any way whatsoever.
Of course.
Well, I mean, that brings up a question, and I'm talking a lot tonight, but what about more contemporary designs? Whatever that catch-all can be, modern design, current design, whatever. The example that everybody points to is NRG. That doesn't look like anything in our town. And yet, I really appreciate that building, visually as well as what it does in terms of energy, placement on the site, all of those kind of things. So I don't want to narrow down the design standards so much that we
Lose innovation.
we can't get buildings like that.
So that's a really good point. I was thinking of it as well, and I think it'd be good to talk about it when we get through the rest of these 4 or 5, because I was thinking the same thing and wondering if we've talked a bit about how these might want to vary by zoning district, and I wonder if in certain zoning districts we might include more flexibility or recognize the need for industrial innovation or industrial design innovation, a la the NRG building, depending on the district in question. Like maybe in the Village Northwest, we don't go there, but maybe in the Village Northeast we do because NRG sits at its center, or perhaps in the commercial district if it were to remain. I know there's been talk about maybe doing away with it or blending it. We allow some new flexibility. I don't think that this first one hamstrings you at all in terms of form or orientation, but the ones further down about material choices and roof pitch might.
And honestly, I think that these regulations would encourage architectural creativity, where if instead of plopping 10 raised ranches down, well, these, because of the orientation restriction, well, this one's got to have a hipped roof on it. So now you've got variety, architectural variety because of these things, and encourages that creativity and diversity.
What if we were to say, no development should have greater than 25% of its buildings the same?
And then let the mix happen.
Yeah,
When you say same, you mean like building materials, or you're talking about
like
forms?
Forms, I guess.
How many different models did Bart Frisbee have up in Thistle Hill?
Wow.
quite a few.
Quite a few.
I mean, a
Much
heck of a
because
lot.
every site was different.
Heck of a lot. Yeah,
Right.
well, that's it, and a heck of a lot more than Grabowski had. But you're right. It isn't just the models. It's the it was the topography
Yep.
that made for some interesting, And that's, I guess that's what's so difficult about this is that, you know, I would love to see innovation and, you know, inspired, you know, something.
Can we use those words?
Exactly, but then I also know that there are developers who will, you know, just, you know, I think you'd have to throttle them to get any kind of, you know, what I see just uninspired. What I see is just uninspired. Bump,
Yeah.
bump.
Yeah. Maybe we attract.
And how do you
Better.
encourage one but without giving too much leeway to the other? I don't know how you do that in words.
I just to James's point though, I did shy away from the focus on a particular development. Like, we will look at this development and it will have some architectural variety standards. And one reason I did that was because I think these are going to get enforced when a zoning permit is requested. Rarely does a developer have all their building designs on the table for the DRB to look at during the subdivision review process. That,
Right.
you know, they are platting a subdivision, they are creating lots. They don't know, maybe they don't know what the building forms are all gonna be. That'll vary based on what the market conditions are and potentially who they sell the project to. You know what I mean? Like, they could subdivide it, have a vision, and then, I'm gonna sell it to Champlain Housing Trust, and they're gonna, you know, build the structures slightly differently. So anyways, I'm not saying it has to be this way, but that was part of my thinking, was like, okay, this has to work for a project that, for any lot, any person who walks in off the street and says, here's my building permit application. And so not all of those are necessarily going to be tagged or tied to a subdivision approval, you know, that went through the DRB. Anyways, that was one reason. There was another reason too that just slipped out of my mind. I think it's just the timing of it. Again, being sensitive to what I hear from developers about, we don't want to make promises about what buildings are going to look like during the review process if we haven't actually hired an architect to design them yet.
I thought they submitted, actually, as an example, BlackRock submitted, these are the type of buildings we're talking about. And there are illustrations, I saw them in your office
they
last
provided
week.
they provided photographs of
Yeah.
not the buildings they're going to build, but
conceptual.
houses that might be similar to what they're going to build.
Right, right.
Yep.
No, they didn't lock themselves in, but they showed some things visually.
They also said, we're not going to show you a design for the larger buildings until we come in with an actual site plan
Sure.
application once we're ready to go forward with those larger buildings, so the mixed use buildings and such. And I in that case, I don't think they're stonewalling. I think they don't know.
No, I think
they haven't designed the buildings. They don't know exactly what they're going to look like. And I suppose we could force them to do that, but I think we ought to work within the model that they work in.
I think that's how developers operate. The bigger, more complex buildings that require a concept, they will show you. But all the others are, we already have so many models of houses.
Right.
You know, do we have to really design the models of the houses for you now? No, developers don't do that.
Anyways, that's why I didn't write it in such a way as to have it be tied to a particular project, but rather just to the permit that would be in front of the zoning administrator that day. You know, like, show me your floor plan, and I'm gonna walk through these design standards for that street that you're on and tell you whether you're good to go or not.
You'd mentioned earlier giving DRB some leeway, and I'd also, I just, would it be just ridiculous to describe the, overall the principle, what we're looking for, architectural variety?
So,
And then, go ahead.
right, we're all planners here. I would love to write this in terms of intentions and things to avoid, and get away from having to fixate on
Nitpick,
two sentences that specifically defines a very rigorous standard. I would much rather do, intention and goals and then make it happen. Like, but we
You just
live in the
can't-
jam golf world, where the
Exactly,
Supreme Court
yeah.
says if you have a standard that is vague and gives your development review board unbridled discretion to say yes or no to anything,
can't
then
do
an applicant
can't
can't
do
know
it.
what it
And
is they're supposed to apply for because
Yeah.
it's too vague.
And I know that the DRB wants more specific guidelines.
Usually, yeah, they like, and the zoning administrator too, especially likes black and white.
Right.
Gray is difficult in her job. So I think we can sort of have our cake and eat it too by having these purpose statements at the beginning of these sections. You know how right now our village design standards talks about Hinesburg does not want to be any place USA. We want to encourage compatible architecture with our existing buildings while still allowing for innovative architecture that comes up. So we have that sort of language in there. We could bolster that some more. But I think if we're going to create design standards, we need to follow some of these other communities, and they came up with very specific design standards. Our trouble is just finding the ones that work for this little village.
Wasn't there a discussion, meeting that I wasn't at, having to do with using images to represent what we're looking
We're
for?
doing that. That's what our
Yes, so
grant
as
was.
soon as I
was
can get a
for.
consultant on board and we have this together, we're gonna give it to the consultant and say, draw this. You know, give us a series of graphics and pictures that shows what our intention is. And some of them will be very easy, you know, in terms of minimum and maximum setbacks and build two lines, right? And others will be a little more stylistic when it comes to, you know, building form and material choice and that sort of thing.
Slight diversion, but how is that search being done for a consultant? Are we going to get to see what the possibilities are and say, talk to these three people and then have them in and?
That's a good question, John.
I mean,
I haven't started that process. I had intended to, but haven't. So my intention, because we got the grant, we kind of have to do it this way, is to put out a request for proposals or a request for qualifications and see what we get back. How many consultants respond, and if we hopefully get 2 or more, then there'll be some kind of, you know, evaluation and selection. I hadn't really thought much about whether that selection would happen at this level or if it would just happen at the staff level, or if maybe the commission, this is probably the best way to do it, would be for the commission to say, we're going to assign these 2 or 3 planning commissioners to work with staff to make that selection. You know what I mean? Instead of having to have that conversation around the table.
Sure. I think that would be wise to involve some of us in that selection process. We've done that before.
We have, yeah, that wouldn't be new, and it'd be particularly interesting to have at least one of you 2 there, because you and Rolf have the, you know, some skill sets that the rest of us don't have.
All right, let's get back to building form because we've got half an hour and I don't think we're gonna make it through all of this.
Come on, the next one's easy, but okay, yeah, so is there anything you want me to, Rolf suggested maybe deleting the second bullet. I think Denver is saying, no, I kind of like the second bullet.
Conviction, you know.
Yeah.
I drew a little streetscape just for fun, right? And it's interesting
This is how
because
architects think.
because
Drawing.
you know, no more than 2 buildings of the equivalent form. You know, like, and you can pass this around. I mean, there's the same form on every one of these houses, okay? But there's something else going on.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm just.
We will
Okay.
definitely need to define what
Okay, so-
equivalent form means if
so-
we're gonna
so-
use
Shows
this
you what a good
language.
So how
architect
about some
To write this.
No. it's
or
not.
throw in an unless there are sufficient variations to
Other variations.
other
yeah.
variations to create the overall
Mix of,
The
yeah.
differences.
yeah. I did throw a contemporary one in
Okay,
there. on the
please
end.
note everybody as we pass this around, the the smoke coming out of the chimneys.
Yeah, it's a polluting neighborhood, that's true.
Make sure Sal gets to look at that too.
What happened?
Nothing.
It's
Well,
Ralph's
yeah.
pen.
We're good.
Renewable
No.
biomass, thank you.
That could be.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
could be.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah,
But I'm just saying, hey, those are all gable forms facing the street,
right.
but there's something else happening.
Well, in a way, it's like the goldsmith's house and the mead's house right next to Lampman's, which are essentially they're the same house,
Yeah.
same builder,
Yeah,
but there's enough slight variation. They're also not right next to each other.
Right.
Which helps.
true.
You see the wood smoke there?
These aren't the same form. What are you talking about?
But they all have the same gable form facing the street.
That's-
Except for the one.
that's
on the end.
orientation.
Except for the modern one
That,
on the
in
end.
my the way I was trying to write this was orientation is not the same as form. How you orient the building to the street is different from
Yeah.
what kind of structure it is. It's a raised ranch. It's a whatever.
Gable end.
And what I see in your drawing are all gable ends facing the street, so that's an orientation issue. Only 7 of the 10 can have that, right? Of the 70%.
I'm up to 5, I'm running low on.
Yeah, but
And
in
what
terms
about-
of
what about
building
your
form, they don't. I don't see more than 2 in a row of the same building form.
Overall building form, yes, that's true. Okay.
A lovely neighborhood, Ralph. I really like it. No, I'm serious. It's
Pass it to
charming.
James.
Please.
If you want me to make the town, I will.
Yeah. You can be mayor and king.
Yeah.
New job.
Well,
I mean-
would you like to move past this and just
Let's do
with
that.
the,
and
with
we'll
the understanding that
we'll
any
come
of
back
you
to
are
it.
welcome to email me anytime saying,
Okay.
remember that discussion we had? I think we should tweak it like this, or I think we need a third bullet that says this. I'm happy to take that.
Yeah, we could all walk around Creekside
Right.
and you know,
Again, with
think
the
about-
purpose in mind, it's about architectural variety. We're trying to have standards
Right,
that
right.
prevents the cookie cutter sameness of
Creekside,
Williston.
is that enough variety? Or
In the
not?
beginning, maybe not, but it looks better.
And maybe
Honestly, it
maybe
does.
that is exactly maybe this is exactly the right time frame to be looking at that neighborhood because it's not 50 years old, right? We didn't have to wait
is it
50 years,
20?
but it's 15.
15?
Yeah.
Okay.
So those houses went in around 2005,
Okay.
2005
went in
to
really
2007.
Because the market was really good,
Right.
which wasn't the case with Thistle Hill.
That's another reason why Thistle Hill looks the way it is.
Yes.
It's not just the topography,
It's done
it's that the
slowly.
economy tanked right
Yeah.
when they got started, and they had to introduce more building shapes or house
Right.
styles than they had intended to.
Yeah,
Because people wanted smaller,
yeah.
which is, yeah. Okay.
All right, let's move on to branding and we'll come back to that conversation.
Yeah, corporate branding. This is language Maggie suggested from looking at other communities that have similar types of language.
I.e., she totally plagiarized. Well, I kind of smushed 2 of them together, so yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, me too.
Seems like a good spot for it.
Everybody good?
Yeah.
That
I
was easy.
liked it. I thought you did a good job, Maggie.
Yeah.
At plagiarizing? I mean, writing? Thank you so much.
At melding something
Melting,
together
right,
that,
that's
you know.
really tactful, yeah.
Okay, so then building material.
What are we trying, what types of materials are we trying to avoid? Or why are there materials?
Vinyl?
Vinyl? You know that's, these developers, they
But
can't
it's not-
function without vinyl. What-
Right. And honestly, no, I'm not gonna go there.
So that's a good question. I think vinyl.
But that's for a bigger building you're talking here, not a single-family home.
Uh,
Am I correct?
No vinyl for a single family home too.
Really? Because I don't understand it to say that. So maybe my edits are
Right.
just-
It does say for buildings other than single-family
Right.
homes and duplexes.
So right now, John, it doesn't say single-family, I believe.
What if we said for,
We could have it be everything. I just thought that
I'm just,
perhaps you don't want to go there when it comes to single-family
Yeah.
homes.
what if
But-
we said for developments other than single unit developments or 2-unit developments?
I mean, this would include Lyman Meadows, right? Because those aren't duplexes.
Correct. So in those cases, it would prohibit vinyl. It would prohibit
corrugated metal siding.
Yes, that's where I
But
was going.
Wait a minute.
Metal
but
sided
that's in-
buildings.
Asphalt shingle.
But that's
Siding.
very, becoming quite stylish in sections of buildings now, Ralph, right?
Yeah.
And are you saying you're against that? Because I think some of these new buildings are really cool.
No, he was just clarifying what the intent of this
sorry.
was.
I was gonna say, I think that's kind of cool.
Well, and so that's a good comment. So this language is cobbed and melded from some other communities, Burlington and Winooski in particular. And yeah, the question is, are some of those more novel or modern materials appropriate in this place?
Well, then you're gonna have some well, it's probably not gonna happen, number one, because it's gonna be done by a developer, worth saying, if we're talking about black, up here.
Well, this standard would apply to any new building created.
In town.
So let's say that we get a new proposal for a building
I would
on
hate
lot
to limit-
15 where Hannaford was proposed.
Yeah.
There's no developer there. It's just an existing lot, and somebody finally proposes something that everybody likes.
I've just seen
These
some
standards could
that.
potentially apply to that too, unless we exempt the commercial district. But
I mean, a few years ago, I never could have pictured it, but now that I've seen it on a few houses, I'm like, wow, that's kind of cool.
right. Well, so I'll be honest with you. I put this in here because when I tried to break this down into like how the buildings are oriented, how are they shaped, materials, something that other towns regulate. I'm not convinced that this is necessary either. And like I said, the communities that I largely pulled it from are the more urban communities,
Right.
Burlington and Winooski.
Yeah.
Of course, you see a lot of innovative architecture and materials in those communities. So I'm not sure exactly how
I
that
think we
works.
would get
but
a ton of pushback on this one, to be
Yeah,
honest.
me too, and I can remember,
Doesn't the
One
town
house that
hall
there
have
was a big-
vinyl siding?
it does.
yes.
If I was building a house in the village and didn't have vinyl siding as an option, I'd be kind of upset.
Yeah, I think I agree.
Because, I mean, it's,
It-
and I mean, new
there's some
new
not
colors
too bad
available
now.
and stuff like that, but, like, it's durable, it protects your house, and
Correct.
it's cheap.
Yeah,
So,
some of
It's
it
tough
isn't that
to-
cheap anymore.
tough to rule out.
Yeah,
Yeah, it is
I
hard
think-
to rule it out.
I think it
Yeah.
is good. I mean,
So am I getting the impression that maybe we just not talk about building material and strike this section?
I'm thinking this is, a little onerous.
I think it's a good tool for us to encourage architectural diversity, give the architects, while this is a similar form to the house next door, but it looks entirely different because it has
Yeah.
clapboard
Right.
siding on it, or cedar siding on it instead of vinyl like next door. I mean, it could be a tool.
If we wanted to throw in one of those, intention type sentences that has absolutely no
Wait.
weight whatsoever,
We hope.
variety of building materials is
that they-
encouraged, of natural building materials is encouraged to provide that kind of variety.
Is that what you were getting at, Denver? That rather than striking this, we instead say it in a more general
way
term
that
that
it's
we're looking for a variety of building materials and not specify, the do's and don'ts?
So
Or were you saying just strike
I
the
like
whole
that
thing?
idea, but I think what I was considering is giving it as an option, maybe where or an exception.
Oh, I
As
see.
far as form, we want variety in a neighborhood. While maybe that doesn't have to come through a different building form. Maybe it comes through
A different
a
material.
different material or a different porch location or something. Like Rolf's Streetscape used similar forms but had variety still. So
Gotcha.
I don't necessarily have a suggestion, but
No, but I understand what you're saying now. That's helpful. And Maggie had suggested when we were talking about the second bullet in the first building form item, some sort of additional language about unless, there are substantial variations to
In
the same
building
theme.
materials.
Yeah, that would
and
be a good place
perhaps
to-
that was where we could tuck this in. including material variety or difference. Okay.
I'm a little concerned with actually giving a list of the materials that are okay.
Because materials change over time, kind of
Yeah, I
thing?
mean, I'm thinking of, there's a trade name, several companies trade name an assembly that has foam insulation on the exterior of a structure, of the supporting structure, and then on that surface is a weatherproof stucco material, and it's a very developed system, and I could imagine an architect coming up with that, using that material in a single-family home,
Yeah.
or in a much bigger building, which is generally where it's applied. That's not here.
Right,
That's
it
not
wouldn't be
here,
allowed
you know.
unless the zoning administrator deemed it to be equivalent or better. Okay, well, I'm sensing
list-
like,
the list
just
is
get
a-
rid of this, too
Or say it
prescriptive.
differently,
Yeah.
if you can come up with a way to say it
Right.
differently.
Using it as a way of encouraging
Yeah,
variety.
get rid of it, but do
Yeah, I like
something
Denver's
different with it,
idea of
but keep it, but
encouraging
not
it.
really, but
Right.
not like this. But
I mean,
sort
if
of,
you
but
really
not
don't
really.
want-
Yeah, just do it.
That's really easy to
If
do.
really what we don't want here is vinyl siding, maybe you instead of saying, well, you can use A, B, and C, you shall not use polymer-based, materials or something like that, and say, well, what we don't want. But I wouldn't necessarily.
You're not
Be in favor.
anti-vinyl, so, yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah.
So it's just,
All I'll say about vinyl is, vinyl is
Vinyl.
final unless it's not. So with this building, for example, a poor color choice was
very
used. But the vinyl siding isn't that old. So when the building got re-sheathed with vinyl, I assume when it was renovated in the
long
in the
time ago.
90s, when all the work got done on the building, that's not when it got
They didn't change
resided.
the siding.
They didn't change the sign.
This siding's been here as long
This
as I've been
predated.
around, and that's like almost
Really?
50 years.
Yeah.
They
Wow.
had vinyl siding.
It may not be
years ago.
vinyl,
didn't think
it
they
might be
did.
metal, I don't know.
No, it's vinyl.
vinyl.
It's vinyl. Anyways, my point is only
Yeah.
that the front of the building is
Very bad.
ugly.
Yes.
Because it's dirty, and
Yes.
when we
Can't
have
get it
tried and we
off.
can't
I
clean
know.
it,
I
and
know.
so vinyl is not final. You either paint it, which isn't going to work with this old vinyl,
Right.
or you have to take it off and reside the building. That and the fact that it's falling off the back of the building.
But it's old,
right.
sorry. But, anyway, they have better materials today than then, but I don't love vinyl either.
Yeah. Well, it's fine.
But I think
got the.
Denver's right. I'd hate, somebody might come up with some good use of it, and I'd hate to restrict. I want people
That's
to have
fine.
an opportunity to be creative.
I will delete the bulk of this, retain some of the spirit included in maybe
Use it
the
in a
exceptions
good
under the other
building
ones.
cross-section and
Right.
Build it, by good standards.
Yep.
The horror story that I know about is in Providence, Rhode Island. They went into an area they wanted to do historic preservation on, down close to the water, and all the buildings had been covered with vinyl. And when they pulled
That's
the
a shame.
vinyl off, the materials underneath were in terrible
Right,
shape
right.
because of being covered up
Yeah.
by the vinyl.
Right.
So, again, it depends on how you apply the material.
Right.
If you put it together in a way that you know that how it works,
True.
then why not use it? It's easy, it's inexpensive, it's easy to put together. You can get a variety of materials, and it does hold up for a long time.
Low maintenance.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think we should just require brick. Everybody has to use brick.
That would be very boring.
So what do you think about the building height standard?
Oh, okay.
Which is basically saying we want multi-story buildings. Single-story buildings are not allowed.
So you're basically discriminating against short buildings?
One story.
Yes, recognizing that the bulk of the buildings we see along our main street are 1.5
You're
story
right.
or more.
You're right.
And that it oftentimes are the single-story buildings that present the biggest aesthetic design issue.
It's a waste
Like
of space.
the brick library.
That's adorable,
Isn't it adorable? Variety,
but it's very tiny.
yeah.
Do all these standards apply to a one lot? Like single lot?
Yes, the way this is written, you walk in off the street and say, I want to pull a permit for my new building, which I should change this to be a principal structure, not any old building, but a principal structure. Not an outbuilding. But yes, that's how it's written, is that if you come in and like, I just want to build my new house on my lot in the village, this would apply.
I guess I'm just concerned about, I mean, maybe this isn't the best example of building height, but, you know, there aren't many lots in the village, but what if there were, and, you know, I don't want to force a project to be more expensive for somebody than it needs to be. I want to consider somebody coming in on a tight budget.
Mm-hmm.
And not, you know, I feel like, I think a lot of these standards, or all these standards, are very appropriate for a, you know, big multi-lot subdivision.
But not so much just a single lot that somebody's coming in with. Yeah, I'm trying to think of a good example. You're right, there aren't very many standalone lots left in the village where someone would come in and just build a house. The one that comes to mind that's actually not in the village growth area, but you all may be familiar with it, is so on Pond Road, right as Mechanicsville Road comes to an end and turns into Pond Road at that four-way intersection with CVU Road and Richmond Road. If you go from Mechanicsville Road straight onto Pond Road, the Alliance Church is on your right, and there are a couple of vacant lots there. One of which is currently being subdivided, and there'll be a new house there, and the other, which is right on the corner that used to be owned by Marie Obie Smith, has been a standalone little lot forever, and finally it sold, and someone's going to build there. And you're right, it feels very different between somebody who just bought a lot that's been there for a long time, is finally going to build on it, than one of these larger subdivisions. But is it? In terms of the form and function of what gets built there, assuming that it's, you know, along a principal street and all of that.
And Gary Fournier did build a one-story rental unit.
He did, yep.
Past that.
Yep.
He did somebody.
It was
he
Gary,
did.
yep.
And and it's a rental unit that's
Well, it's
somewhat
a house.
affordable.
It's a house.
It's a house, but he rents it out.
Right,
And it is one story. So that's a good point.
right.
Or what
It's
if,
more affordable,
what
I
if an
guess.
elderly couple buys a lot?
Yeah, they might not want
They
two
wanna live
stories.
on one floor.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think for looks, though, 1.5 story isn't that much more expensive and is more attractive. That's
One
my
and a half
personal
is
opinion.
like a split level.
No, you don't even use the other half. It's just your ceilings are higher, right? You don't go upstairs necessarily,
Yeah,
but you
Well-
might have a vaulted ceiling or.
yeah.
Plenty of 1.5 story homes have a second story. It's
They
just
do.
that they're built into
you could
the
choose not to.
roof,
Right.
as opposed to having a full second story.
But you could choose to have it be a one-story
Right.
house with
You-
1.5.
You could.
And it,
But it does beg the question, are we eliminating the ability to create single level living for an aging population? And what does this actually achieve? You know, what do we actually accomplish with this?
Well, if we're talking village, I mean, one other, you know, we do want the density in the village, and
you're not gonna
using
get
a single lot for a,
one story.
you know, for a one story is, you
So-
know, it's not maxing out the density.
So that's exactly where this is coming from, largely. It's not so much an aesthetic thing as it is, let's maximize the use of the one place in town where we have services and we anticipate more happening. However, it's possible that the last sentence is maybe more important than the 1.5 story minimum. You know, requiring that a minimum percentage of a street have multi-story buildings might be more important than saying you can't have a single-story building. The reason that the single-story building comes into my mind is less about single-family homes and more about non-residential structures, like a Kinney Drugs, where they come in and say, we only build one-story buildings. We're gonna build an 11,000 square foot one-story building. That's what we do. And the angst that we had in reviewing that project, because nobody wanted to see a single level box.
But isn't that corporate branding?
No, actually, it's not, because
It's
the
cheap- they're
building
just
doesn't
cheap to build.
advertise itself as Kinney Drugs per se. It's just
Flat boxes.
it's just the style that they utilize. So that's where having a minimum of 1.5 stories prevents that from happening and just from the outset tells the architect for the project, I have to figure out a way to make this thing work as a 1.5 story building or more. And so we could be more specific if that were still a concern. We could talk about minimum number of stories for non-residential buildings, or within certain zoning districts, so as not to limit as much the single-family homes or small, tiny houses, you know, on one level.
My experience with single floor buildings, 2 or 3 of several libraries that our office designed were all single story.
Mm-hmm.
New buildings,
Not 1.5.
not 1.5. The Charlotte Library is one floor. Now there's a loft space that they have used as part of their office, you know, back room stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But otherwise, it's entirely a single floor. So that kind of, I think of an office building even, why shouldn't the police station, the old police station, actually has 2 floors within that one floored building that they bump the roof up a little bit, but there's 2 floors tucked in what looks like a 1-floor building.
Well, that was always a 1.5 story building, I believe, you know, prior to
Prior-
them leaving.
right,
It,
prior
it
to-
met this
Right.
standard.
And what do you call the new police station? Weren't you involved in the design of that?
That is 1 story,
It
but
is-
there is,
is-
but built into that is the possibility of a 2nd floor.
Yeah, okay.
The structure was arranged, there's a space for a stair to go up to a
Yep.
2nd floor and so forth, and the exterior of the building wouldn't change.
Right, and so as I look at that building, I don't see that as a 1-story building.
Me either.
It was built to be a 1.5 story building. Whereas the Aubuchon Plaza
That's
is a 1-story building. No getting around that.
Yeah, and the gas station, I mean.
Right, the gas station, the mobile station's a good
Both-
example.
both
The
mobile
new
stations,
Jiffy
both
Mart
gas
is
stations.
a 1-story building. Heart and Meat is a 1-story building.
What if we had a percentage where we said no more than 10% or 90% of buildings on a given street shall be 1.5 stories or greater. 60% shall be 2 stories. Where basically we can have 1 single-story building on this street, but we don't want them all to be single stories. But it would allow that elderly couple to buy a lot and put a single-story home on it. It's not restricted entirely, but we don't necessarily want a full neighborhood full of 1-story buildings, where we could regulate that by a percentage.
Which you're doing to some degree already.
So what this proposed was to take advantage of our street type differentiation and to say on certain streets, we're gonna mandate what percentage of 1 and 2 story buildings, you can have. And so A and D are if I flip back here, A is a mixed-use active streetscape, meaning it's not purely residential, it's not purely non-residential, it's both. And D is Route 116. So the idea was that within a residential neighborhood, within a purely residential street, we wouldn't dictate 60% of the frontage having 2 stories or more. And similarly, in a commercial industrial street, we might not. So there's different ways to slice the apple. What you suggested, Denver, is another way. I'm just sensitive to what you're saying about 1-story buildings, and there's no magic behind this 1.5 stories. It's just that a lot of the buildings in our village are that. They're 1.5 or 2, and so that's just sort of where I landed. But we could easily scratch that out and be more specific about street types and what percentage, need to be multi-story buildings.
I think having this as it relates to commercial buildings, I can definitely see how this will help to avoid the, big rectangular box store look.
Well, that's a good point. Multi-story buildings are anticipated, and then buildings shall be a minimum. So it's not specified.
Right. It's all buildings. It's not saying commercial or non-residential or residential. So we could be more specific to just mixed use and non-residential buildings and leave purely residential buildings out of the mix. We could also be specific to street types, or we could do both. Is there general agreement that you want to go in this direction at all? That you want to mandate there be a certain percentage of multi-story buildings?
On certain streets?
Yeah, or not?
I thought we were going towards more densely, I think we had a discussion about not even allowing 1-story buildings a long time ago.
No, this is in here because we've had those discussions and I've been pushing you in that direction, but I just want to make sure now that we're talking about it, that even if this needs to be massaged, is this still the right direction to go? If everybody's nodding yes, then we can.
I think so. The things we're pondering are kind of like, that James raised and you raised as well, but also situations where, you sort of hear talk about like incubator manufacturing facilities of some kind or another that under most circumstances are most cheaply built as a 1-story structure of some kind.
Right.
So being able to sort of still have a mix. It's just what this says is all buildings shall be 1.5 stories.
Right.
Now, even if it's a manufacturing or a startup of some kind, a 1.5-story structure is probably, in terms of scale, what you'd be making perhaps anyway. You may not have a floor on that 1.5 stories, a second floor,
Right.
but you may have the height that an industrial structure of some kind might require.
But is that going to invite in flat boxes like
Yeah, to some degree it will.
Kinney's and dollar
Yeah.
stores?
Dollar General.
Because I don't want to go there. I don't think flat boxes are the way, or
Yeah.
what we need in the village. That's not a direction.
What do people think of the UVM medical building?
Not much.
It's not very attractive.
It's flat.
Since
I mean,
you
why
asked.
on earth did they do 1 story when
I know.
it could have been 2-story with office,
Right.
offices above, or I just,
It's not
I
what
think it's a waste.
expected.
I think it's a
I mean,
waste
Tilly
of
Drive,
space.
UVM has facilities there in 2-story buildings.
They're all two-story, aren't they? Or
Yeah,
It's a more expensive building to build, probably.
Yeah, there's an office building that's 2 stories, but there's a building
kind of
that's
a-
entirely UVM stuff, and it's 2 stories.
Right.
It's essentially the same plan.
Interestingly, they bought, so they developed that
Yeah, and they
site
bought the
And they
corner.
bought
and
next
they
door.
planned it so that that building could be expanded a bit on that site
Yeah,
in the future. And then they bought the lot next door on the
The
corner
100% corner.
so that they could potentially expand further. Whereas if they had just planned for
Gone,
the
if they
building to
just
go up,
built up.
there could have
Yeah.
been something, somebody else
Yeah.
could have bought that corner lot and done something altogether
Yeah.
different there.
yeah. Who
Well,
knows
and
what
it's,
their whole
the
plan is.
irony is that, the roof is big enough,
Right,
it's probably all trusses up,
right. It
up
could
there.
be 2 stories.
Could they go up?
But, yeah, you probably already got the volume in the building that you have there to have at least a 50% of the first floor on the second floor. you know.
That was the question that we talked about in the police station, the new police station. Whether to do that roof system where it was all full of trusses, or let's do a more expensive roof system and get a usable space up there.
That's what you do.
And that's what we ended up doing.
Okay, so I'm gonna tweak this bit, maybe take out the 1.5 story, focus more on the requirement for a percentage of multi-story, and maybe, we're gonna have to come back to this to explore whether it's non-residential only, street type based, or both.
Yeah, asterisks, I definitely wanna come back to this, I'm getting a little nervous actually about this one.
And the
so.
designation of just saying 1.5 story, what does that mean? We've already talked about buildings that are 1.5 stories that have no story in them.
Right.
So, if we're gonna, that
Yeah.
seems to be more building height, you say, the building
Yeah.
has to be.
Yeah,
this
that's a
height.
good point, John, and that's why I put the asterisks in about having to review the definition in our current definitions in zoning of story and half
What-
story.
right.
Because I think the definition of half story means that it's usable
It's
space.
usable
It's
space.
not
It has a
just,
certain clearance,
yeah,
floor to ceiling clearance in
yeah,
it.
exactly. So it may be that what we really want to talk about is height. It's just that the other communities had tended to use stories. So
They're wrong.
that's where I went.
How about, do we have something on the books regulating maximum height?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't necessarily need to address, do we want a 10-story building in the village?
No, our maximum height is 35 feet unless you get some bonuses, which are possible, and then you can go up to 45 feet. So we're basically capped out at 3, I guess a 4-story building is technically possible.
Those existing Italianate buildings are 3 along Main Street here, right?
Part.
In part, yeah.
Okay, so that's building height, still a little problematic, needs more work. The last one is roof lines and pitch.
You got it covered here.
So where did this come from?
Well, so
Out of your head, I know.
our current regulations
It's not like
already,
you would have plagiarized
right,
anything.
our current regulations
did
already
those drawings.
require moderate to steeply pitched roofs. So it's in our design standards today. And it allows for flat roofs only if they emulate the historic design of our existing flat roof buildings along Main Street. So
Yeah.
the Twice as Nice building and the 2 buildings beyond that that
So-
are apartments and John Lyman's house.
So if they have a cornice and a parapet.
Right, which is what those
For
have.
visual
So
interest.
you asked where this came from. It comes from our existing regs with additional language added to specify what that pitch is. Our current language doesn't say what moderate to steeply pitched means. And so this specifies that it's no less than a 6 on 12 pitch.
So I like that, and I like the pretty pictures. Those are fun.
Those are mostly for your benefit, not necessarily to include in the regs.
Okay.
Because we're gonna have somebody draw some real,
Okay.
fancy pictures.
But I want to get back to the flat roofs.
Yes.
Because we don't specify whether 1 story, 2 story, 3 story. I'm still concerned about flat roof on a single story building.
That's a really good point. I hadn't
I don't
actually
care if
thought
it
of
has
that.
a cornice or a parapet.
Right, if it's only,
If it's only one story.
if it's only one story and the roof line is,
Well, again, you've got
18 feet
gas
up or-
stations.
Right.
Gas stations are 1 story and they have flat roofs.
well, the mobile station
Not
does
that
not.
Yeah, not the
stations in our
jelly.
town,
The
right?
mobile station has a peaked roof. I don't think it would meet the this pitch requirement, but
612? No.
it could easily have been constructed to meet
Oh,
that.
yeah.
The Jiffy Mart up on Charter Falls Road is definitely flat.
Well, we're done with gas stations, right? Isn't there some rule, no more gas stations?
We should require.
Yeah, regulation 3.8, no more gas.
Well,
We have a separation distance that effectively limits them,
we have
yes.
some limit on it. I don't know how it's stated.
Right, but
But
someday,
we do.
Hart and Mead, could be reconstructed.
Yep. Unlikely, but
I think we should require pollination.
I like the butterfly. I've never seen a roof like that
Or the
before.
612
Dome
butterfly.
Okay, focus, people.
Right, yeah, it
Focus.
really collects water and snow and ice.
But this is going away.
So can you finish your point, Maggie? You're basically saying that a flat roof with cornices and parapets that look
For
nice
second or third,
only work
two-
if the building is
Yeah.
multi-story.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I should work some language in about that. No flat roofs for single-story buildings.
Unless they're a gas station. I mean,
No,
how
not
do you deal,
necessary.
Well, that's
do
just
you
it.
deal with the commercial?
No, only groin vaults
residential?
for gas stations.
So the thing
Only
is,
what?
gas stations can meet these
No,
roof
they can.
pitch
They can.
requirements.
That's
They
true.
just need
Okay,
to know
so-
that we have the requirement,
Okay,
and then
yeah.
they'll meet it.
Yeah,
The fact that
that's-
we have some that don't doesn't mean that they couldn't have been built to meet
Yeah,
the requirement.
You're right, you're right.
There may be pushback, but I think you can make the case. All right, so I'll make a note about the single-story flat roof problem.
So is this saying that a building could have a shed roof or no? Secondary shed roof, is that?
Well, shed roof is the next picture on to the right. What do you feel about that, Maggie? That's got a pitch to it. A shed roof, right?
So in the diagram here
Am I
that
right?
shows a shed
Secondary.
roof,
It's
which
It's
is
not really flat.
hard to see on the
It's
screen.
got
I'll-
a
Well, but
pitch.
they can only be used over building elements such as porches or dormers.
Oh, okay, so that takes care of that.
Seems like
So a house that has a single roof line that starts at one side and then slopes down is what they show as a shed roof, and that would be required to have the 6-on-12 pitch, just like a peaked roof.
but a shed roof is allowed.
Yes. Yep.
But a secondary shed roof, as in, if you have a gambrel
We
with a
got
porch
almost
over
a
it, it would
mountain.
have to be, it would only have to be 212.
Right. It could be much less pitched if it's if you stick a dormer out on one side and want to have a much lower pitch over that, or covered porch.
Or a bay window or something.
Right.
That has a roof on it.
Yeah. And I don't know that these numbers are right. You guys who do this stuff might want to think about that. That's why I put the pictures in there. This is based on several other communities that have a range from 5-on-12 for a principal roof to more of them had 6-on-12. And in my mind, I thought 6-on-12 was more
appealing.
true to a moderate to steeply pitched roof than 4 or 5-on-12, which it's getting pretty low pitch at that
But it's
point.
like, looks like a chicken factory.
Just to
They
jump
grow
back a
chickens.
minute, we
I grew up
decided
in Maine, and
that
we
building
had a lot of
materials
those
was
there.
gonna go away. Because
Yeah.
that, I'm thinking roof materials, metal roofs, standing seam, shingles,
Trying to lose it.
tile,
Sounds like
whatever.
they're all going to be
They're-
possible.
Yeah, yeah.
Any other thoughts beyond Maggie's flagging the single-story flat roof?
This really only pertains to the village growth area.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We
I
won't get
asked
a,
because I was designing a house for someone where the pitch is a shed roof, 2.5 and 12 at the moment.
yeah.
So just to verify. Of course, it's not in Hinesburg, but.
We're saying there is a
wouldn't
house in
let you in.
Hinesburg with a shed roof on Silver Street, I think.
Yep, yeah.
Down where Ginny Iverson's
Yeah.
place is,
Yeah.
with the marshmallow.
That's probably less than 6 and 12.
I don't know what it is, but it's, I
Yeah,
recall
bet
that a
that's,
shed
I
roof.
bet that's less than
Yeah.
6 and 12.
Okay.
So,
We're not gonna get a roof like the, car wash up in Williston.
The
Oh, my
corporate
Lord.
branding will prevent that
That's
from
corporate
happening.
branding, isn't it?
Is
so,
it? Is
so
that?
if we're done, can we've got like 3 minutes to move on to building height relief? Are we done with the,
Sure, yeah.
is it?
And Rolf can speak to this one. Rolf, this is a little bit different, I think, than what you
Road?
wrote, but maybe
For the better?
no. Actually, it's pretty similar. But
I mean,
maybe you
there's
want to
things in
explain
here
it.
Like the 8 feet. I mean, this was, you know, in places where it looked as if you could squish in a 4-story structure within our height limit, which is what, 40 feet?
So our height limit's 35, but if you get a bonus through section 2.9, you can get an additional 10 feet. So you can go up to 45,
Okay.
which certainly you could do a 4-story building at
So the
45.
notion was that if you wanted to do that, you could do it, but the first 2 floors could go straight up. But then you had to step the next floor back. And I said 8 feet, but there's nothing magic about that 8 feet. It could be
10.
more, it could be less. You know, it's a question of when you stand down here,
I think it's more the effect. I mean,
it just sort of maintains a kind of, you know, those Italianate structures are down the way here are all like 2 and 2.5, approximating 3.
Yeah. Yeah.
When
When they're
you remember the porches in Virgins on that
I was
corner
gonna say,
building?
we saw that in
Yeah.
Virginia.
showed us
It just
pictures.
kind of went up and then it stepped back and
It lightens it a bit.
it
makes
made
less-
it more palatable, I
Yeah.
thought.
So do you not want to say a minimum of 8 feet then?
Well, I just wanted you guys to know that there's nothing magic about the 8 feet. It's not like there was a scientific analysis done.
It implies a usable area for
Yeah,
exterior
it could be
use.
a flat porch area, you know. Which, you know, if you start envisioning multiple use buildings with the first floor being sort of commercial stuff, the second floor maybe being some office stuff, the third floor is some housing, and then they've got a balcony to step out onto, say for
Yeah.
example, in that
Yeah.
8 feet.
I like balconies. Let's go with it.
So that was
I had one question on this for Al Barber, which is, so there's a fundamental question and then there's just a fun question. The fun question is, if a 4-story building ever got built and it was required to step back like this, would that step back create a problem for fire protection in terms of getting up to that building, or would it actually make it easier
To get up
and
to
be
that level,
yeah.
and then
to have a ladder to come up 2 stories and then another ladder to? So I'd like to ask him that.
Yeah.
The more fundamental question is, until we have the aerial truck, we really shouldn't be allowing even 3-story buildings. So should we even have language that allows that to happen at all right now? Because we don't have that truck.
and everything that's existing is grandfathered, and we just
Was
don't
that
let
some
it
kind of
anymore.
building code thing, or, you know, like if you sprinkler a building like this,
So
Actually, it
so
had it.
so
often what's
So we're
required.
having this conversation right
Hard to
now
sprinkle
with
in
the Haystack
Hinesburg.
project because there's a senior housing building proposed. It's 3 stories. It has underbuilding parking, so it's possible that
4 levels.
that the first floor elevation won't be flush with ground. It
grade.
might be elevated a little bit, which means, you know,
Yep.
it's 3 stories on top of something that's already a little elevated.
Right.
And it'll certainly be sprinklered and have elevators and all of those wonderful things. And we're having the conversation with Al about should it happen if we don't have a truck that can extract people from that 3rd floor living space, in the event that the sprinkler system doesn't do the trick and there are people trapped on the 3rd floor because the fire broke out, you know, on lower floors. when we only have ladders that can reach 28 feet high.
And 9 miles down the road is Williston with a ladder truck.
Right, so that's the other part of it, is that we have all these mutual aid agreements, and we have Williston and Essex and other community, and Shelburne, once they have drivers to drive their new truck, that have these pieces of equipment, and so, I don't know.
For 1 or 2 buildings, do we invest the huge amount that we would? I mean, just
to get that
imagine that as a
equipment.
capital
Well,
expense.
and from, that's a good question from capital expense and infrastructure standpoint, but from a planning standpoint, are we putting the cart before the horse by having our planning allow for buildings that we may not be able to protect?
Not if we have mutual aid.
Not
Or
with
are we
mutual aid,
putting
right?
the cart before the horse, spending all that money on a ladder truck
Right.
when we
When
end
we
up?
don't.
I mean, look at Hinesburg Family Health.
Yeah.
You know, 1 story when they could have done 3. So
It might be a conversation, I mean, I think 3 and 4 story buildings, if they're of a particular construction type and they're protected with, you know, a fire suppression system, doesn't matter what the fire engine in town is.
Right,
That building's legitimately allowed by the state building code.
right. The difficulty in Hinesburg is a sprinkler system.
Yep.
You need to have a certain flow, and you need to have that over a certain length of time, and it has to be at a certain pressure. Not all of those things
easy to
happen
do.
by just hooking into our current residential, essentially, water
Typically have
system.
like a pressurized tank.
But with the new.
Yeah, but it's more than that. It's, you've got to have backup power to keep that pressure. You've got to have storage so that you can replace, if you lose the water source, you can replace that at a certain flow over a certain time. We got deeply into this when our office did the renovations on the White Building, which turned out to be a 2-story building, even though it's half floor out of the ground, and then the 2 stories on top of it. It turns out that the perimeter measurement in the code allows you to be a certain amount out of the ground, and it doesn't count.
Interesting,
essentially.
yeah, because I always think of that as a 3-story building.
Right, and it's used that way. There is, maybe not class space, but there is teaching space on the bottom floor, as well as restrooms.
And your
And
point is, when
mechanical
you
space.
looked at the sprinkler system and the town's water system, there were issues?
Right, there were
Okay.
definitely issues. There wasn't enough flow, there wasn't enough pressure. So
How long ago was that?
That was a long time ago.
15
20 years ago,
So that was that before we had the water tank
Right,
up by
yes.
Piat?
Yes.
Yep.
So I don't think we have that problem anymore.
Well-
Because of that tank, we have lots of pressure in our water system and
But-
lots of storage.
maybe so, but I'm just saying that is an issue
Yeah.
that a developer of that building would need to address.
Well, in any
And
case,
maybe it's
I
solved.
bring
They
it
wanna
up
talk to
only
the state
because
fire
if we're talking about this, it would make sense to just know that a 4-story building really is in the realm of possible before we start telling people how to build the
good.
4-story
Yeah.
And if
building.
somebody's, a developer proposes 12 of them, then we should have that.
But if the rules are here, at least they'll be here if it does change.
Right, I guess what I'm saying
So,
is if
It's not up to us to.
if the conversation with the fire chief says this town should not be hosting 4-story buildings until maybe, 3 or 4 or 5 years from now when we have different equipment or better equipment, then perhaps we don't write this in yet and we go back and tweak that density bonus section that gives people an extra 10 feet and say, no, you don't get
We don't want
that.
to do that right now.
Right. We'll turn that on in the regs later. Anyways, assuming that we can accommodate it with mutual aid and all that, does everybody feel like this building height relief is a valuable add to the design standards?
Yeah,
Where would an impact fee come in? So if
Well, they've already got
developers
them.
are building 4-story buildings,
is there an impact fee? Yeah.
Yeah.
can they be paying us?
Yeah, so we're as Maggie said, we're collecting it. We have been collecting it for what was it, 2009? So 11 years we've been collecting impact fees to pay for a new aerial truck to be able to reach higher heights. So that we don't have yet. So everybody's paying that, not just developers of larger buildings, but anyone who puts an addition on their house pays a little bit of an impact, actually not a little bit, a pretty substantial impact fee to fire that will go towards that truck. And we have, some money saved, and at least for the Haystack project, Mitch did a calculation to figure out how much in impact fees that project in and of itself would generate. It's not enough to pay for a truck 100%, but it pays for a percentage.
So I'm gonna drag us back
To the agenda?
to the agenda.
Okay.
So we've sort of wrapped this up, maybe no ribbons yet, but we'll come back and look at the whole big
Right,
picture. You've
there
got
are a
additional-
few more new ones to draft,
Yeah.
although I'll tell you that as we get closer to the end of these, I see my mind has a lot of repetition with what we've already talked about, so there's not a whole lot left in my mind to draft.
Okay.
So anyways, next meeting, the rest of it.
All right. Okay, so let's move on to minutes of the February 26th meeting. And three of you weren't here anyway. So let's see, only three of us were here. Can we even do minutes, or does anyone care?
I would make a motion that we accept them.
Is three enough, Alex, to vote on?
I always say that there's nothing that requires the approval of minutes, so having a formal approved motion to approve minutes isn't even really necessary.
You say that every time, but we like doing it.
You like to do it.
So-
So the workaround is people who weren't here can simply vote with the majority,
Okay.
and then you have your quorum.
All right,
if you
does
want.
anyone have any changes or additions or deletions?
So we're not supposed to abstain if we weren't here?
You don't have to abstain. You can still vote on them based on.
Well,
Anything you are
People who weren't
recorded
here
as
would've received
saying
a
in the
copy,
minutes that
right,
you
for
would like to
review.
deny
Oh, but
at this
they're-
point?
They couldn't claim something
I didn't
wasn't
say that,
accurate.
Marie
or
said
something.
Right.
No changes, no additions. We have a motion second.
Second.
All in favor of approving the minutes of February 26th? Aye.
Is it all right for somebody who wasn't here?
Okay. He just did.
Yeah.
So,
I did it.
okay. All right.
And for Sal's benefit, that was everybody all in favor?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
more or less. Okay, other business, including something that John would like to talk about, but
Right, but first you have to elect officers.
officers,
And some people aren't here, so they'd be
fair game.
fair victims to, nominate them to a position they have no control over. But
Awesome.
I'm just kidding about that. You need a chairperson and a vice chairperson. We haven't done elections in a while. Maggie's your current chair. The vice chair position is empty because Joe Iadanza was that. And Denver does not look like Joe Iadanza, even though he replaced him. So, yeah, if you don't have to do it tonight, but if you're prepared to do it tonight,
It would be a good time, considering,
somebody needs to make a motion to
Yeah.
appoint somebody as
I
chair
make a
and vice
motion
chair.
to appoint Maggie.
Second.
I would second that.
that's 5 people who really don't want to be chair.
That's usually how it
Yeah.
works.
Yeah.
You're doing a good job, Maggie.
Yeah, we love it.
Nobody steps forward, everyone else just steps back, is how it goes.
So that's a motion and a second.
Yeah, we,
Second,
no, we have a second.
Yeah.
Somebody said
Yeah.
second, John, I
There were
think.
3 seconds.
okay,
Sal's gonna pick one of you who said something.
all right. All in favor?
Aye.
Okie dokie.
Now I need a vice chair in case
Are you in
Maggie's not.
favor, Maggie?
Yeah,
I
did
am.
you vote?
I am.
Okay, good, yeah.
It's my, yeah.
It's her cross to bear.
No, it's part of my evil plan for world domination. Just one little planning commission meeting at a time. So now we need a motion to appoint someone as vice chair.
I could have predicted that.
Okay, So, I make a
Joanne.
motion to, no, we can't, Joe's not here, we can't, to appoint Rolf as vice chair.
Second.
So, what does that mean?
You
He's
run-
in
you run the
agreement there.
meeting when she's not here.
That's all?
Yeah,
That's
that's
it.
all you have to do.
All
Oh,
right,
wait, it's up to me to say.
all right, I can do that.
Perfect.
How much longer do I have on this planning commission?
That's a good question, Ralph.
This year.
Is this gonna, what pushes you off?
No, I think you're longer than this year. I'm done. Mine is this year.
I'll check, Ralph. It's on the website. I don't remember off the
Yours
top of
is
my
this
head.
year?
The 21, January 21.
Is it? Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, mine too.
Never mind.
Well, a lot of us are that, I think.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out
Okay,
how.
someone
it's so
second,
soon.
all in, you said okay?
Yes. Is that
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Sorry, Ralph.
Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Okay, so I'm just gonna say one thing on the chair thing. And I know I've said this before, but I know that I'm a lot more, focused on the reality that, we have exactly 4 hours per month to do everything that we need to do. So I do try to focus discussion, and it's can be really tough because it's so interesting, everything that we're talking about. But I think if we're just aware of like limiting digressions as much as possible, and if you ever feel like I'm cutting off discussion when I shouldn't, just let me know. And there.
You're doing well.
Thank you.
You're doing good.
Yeah, we like it.
Even though I don't bake.
It's okay.
You know,
Ralph's taken that position too. Yeah.
Okay,
He's
good.
showing his talent.
Okay, so updates and other PC projects.
Right, so you have several other projects in the works. We talked about the contractor yard regulation revision some time ago, and the subcommittee, after I think James had a question and there was some uncertainty, the subcommittee met again to try to tune those up, and that's in process. But I'm doing a redraft that I haven't done yet, and then the committee's gonna look at it before it comes back to the full commission. So just know that that's happening, but not very fast.
This was the issue precipitated by whitetail.
Precipitated, actually, to be honest, it's been an action item in our town plan for some number of years, and yes, there was a specific property that cropped up as being problematic in that regard. Whitetail Landscaping was that property.
But the fact is, every single contractor's yard, pretty much in this town, is in violation. They're all grandfathered.
Well, most of them are grandfathered and are therefore not in violation.
Well, but they
don't,
would be
They
if
don't
they-
meet the
none
regulations
of them
because
do.
they don't have
Yeah.
to, because they were grandfathered in. And in any case, it's something that's been on our radar screen for a long time, but this issue with Whitetail Landscaping sort of gave us the kick in the pants to take it up. So expect to see more on that, but progress has been slow. So the water and wastewater allocation system, scoring system, you had a public hearing on that not too long ago and felt that there was a problem with the system in terms of business allocation for businesses and being able to act quickly on that. So my charge was to reactivate that committee that had developed the plan in the first place before it got to you and get their suggestions. And that's also in progress. Hasn't happened yet, but will. Anyways, I'm just telling you it's underway, but nothing to give you yet. Finally, the Energy Committee spent a good amount of time last year working with a regional planning commission staff member on an update to the energy chapter of the town plan, in the hopes that were that to be adopted as a revision to the town plan, that Hinesburg would qualify for, what's the status? It's basically like a enhanced designation status where any projects that come before the Public Utility Commission for new power plants or solar arrays or wind farms would have to pay more attention to the recommendations and requirements in our town plan for those kind of facilities. So right now, the Public Utility Commission is supposed to, I forget the actual terminology, they're supposed to give due regard to recommendations in our plan, but they don't have to follow them. And were we to update our energy plan and get it approved, then that commission would have to give substantial deference to whatever recommendations are in our town plan, which is a much higher legal standard. Anyways, that's one of the advantages of adopting an updated energy plan. There are several others, principle of which is just being clearer about how Hinesburg is going to contribute to the state of Vermont meeting what are very ambitious goals for energy use and renewable energy use by 2050. And the state has an energy plan on that front, and unless communities are actively partnering and working with the state on that, we're never going to reach those goals. So the Energy Committee, as you can imagine, is very much in favor of the town doing everything we can to meet those goals, you know, taking more internal combustion engines off the road, improving our building efficiency, all of those things. So, long story short, they worked with the Regional Planning Commission, who's been working with most of the Chittenden County communities to prepare an enhanced energy plan. And it's a town plan update. So it needs to go through you. You need to be comfortable with it, maybe make some revisions, and then have a hearing and pass it on to the select board. So it's not completely ready for you to look at yet, but it's pretty darn close. And the Energy Committee is basically just waiting for me to let them onto your agenda. So just know that that's going to happen sometime.
They're going to come and talk about this?
Yes. Yep, they're going to describe it to you and tell you why it's the best thing since sliced bread.
Okay. All right, sounds good.
Non-planning commission projects, the Conservation Commission is doing a natural resource inventory. They had a meeting with their consultant on a first draft of that earlier Monday, was it, Maggie? Maggie was there, and I think the intent is to roll out a final product sometime late summer or early fall. It's kind of interesting. The consultant basically collected a lot of natural resource information that some of which we already use and already map, and others of which we don't actively use. And he's putting it together in a format that will be online, that the Regional Planning Commission will help host through a website, so that it will, once that happens, it will no longer be just Alex and Mitch upstairs on the third floor who can make pretty maps and sort of visualize lots of data at the same time in a geographic sense, but everyone in town will be able to do that on the website. Wow. And turn on different layers and turn them off and zoom in and out.
Fairly fine grid too.
Yeah. So it's pretty exciting.
Pretty specific.
It's pretty exciting, and there will be some training on it once it's ready, probably late summer. So you'll hear more about that.
Okay, and now the most exciting.
The best other related project is the one Maggie and I met about just before this meeting, which is this idea to design your own park, create a town common. We need to come up with a good, snappy tagline for this, but the pop-up park that Maggie and I and some others helped organize last summer in the green space behind the police station generated a lot of good enthusiasm and ideas about what could happen in that space. And so the select board is very much chomping at the bit to start making improvements. And as much as I appreciate the voters and our new select board members, I'm a little sad that Tom's off the select board, because he was one of the big advocates on the select board saying, enough, let's start making progress.
That's right, he's got free time, we'll put him on the
That's right,
committee.
we'll put him on the committee.
Yeah.
But in any case, this is all by way of saying there's a lot of energy to start doing something positive in that space besides just having it be a grassy lawn. And Maggie and I applied for a small grant from the Vermont Natural Resources Council to have a design charette this next month to invite the community in to help design that space. And so we're gonna do it, and it's gonna be on April 14th, I
You got
believe.
the grant.
We got the grant, yeah. It's only $900, but it's enough to help pay for, food to entice people to come and some supplies and, most importantly and fun, Maggie's gonna help us order a bunch of HO scale, figures of things that people will be able to physically place on the plan that we're creating to get a sense of what it would look like to scale, of benches and play structures and the like. And in any case, we're planning for that for the 14th, with some follow-up, maybe drop-in sessions the days following that, and you'll be hearing more about that. The hope is that we could prepare a conceptual plan for the select board to look at in May. And then once June rolls around, before the end of the fiscal year, the select board could maybe spend some money.
So they have some to spend?
They have $2,500 in this year's budget. It's actually in the capital budget, so it could be used in any year. Doesn't have to be just this year, but they have $2,500, and that was their sort of seed money to get something going. Maybe just tree
Identified
planting.
with that lot.
Yeah, yep, specific to that lot.
So is the charette like from 6 to 8 or something?
Our idea was to have it in the evening. We haven't pinned the time down yet, but I think it will be likely 6 to 8. That sounds like a good time horizon, or 6 to 7:30. And it'll involve dinner and hopefully a fun team-based exercise to do some actual design work, tabletop.
Speed designing.
Yes,
And the date?
April 14th. Which is a Tuesday. Last on your agenda is just a notice that the town of Charlotte is having a public hearing, Denver, especially for your benefit, since you're new. Anytime a town has a planning commission of a town has a public hearing for a zoning change, they have to notify the adjacent municipalities. So we get these notices with some regularity. And we have no interest in the change that they're making, but sometimes they do things that are interesting and illuminating. Every once in a great while, they might do something that would have a potential impact on the adjacent area in our town, which I think is why the notification happens. Rarely does it ever come to that, though. In this case, it's a change to their parking requirements, and it's not something that their planning commission has proposed. They received a petition from citizens to modify the zoning, and as a result, they're required to hold this hearing on something they don't support.
They want to park all their cars in Hinesburg?
Right on the edge, right on the border.
That is not what they want to do.
Hinesburg.
I thought I had it pulled up here. I wanted to just tell you what the actual proposal was. Let me find it. Yeah, here it is. It is a repeal of a portion of their regulations that would reduce the standards for parking and loading in service areas. So now I remember what it is. Essentially, there's a citizen group that doesn't like the fact that you can't have parking in the front yard of buildings, in front of buildings.
Which we don't allow either.
Which we don't allow either. Most communities don't allow it. It's sort of a general planning precept that you want buildings that front the street and not parking lots. Anyways, there's a group of citizens that wants to be able to have new development, have parking lots in the front of buildings, and that's what this public hearing is about. Planning Commission doesn't support it, but they're gonna have a
Should be
hearing.
interesting.
Yeah,
Be an interesting meeting.
I think it will be.
All right, and John, you had a question on something?
Yeah, the intersection of North Road, Richmond Road.
Would you like an update on that project?
What's going on?
All right. Just take a quick step backwards. Each year, I think I explained this in the last meeting, each year the select board considers projects that we might want the help of the Regional Planning Commission with, and typically their planning money flows around transportation-related items. So last year, when the select board talked about that, they said, hey, one of those projects that they helped us do was a sidewalk study for the whole Richmond Road corridor. And we did it, and we have this very large cost estimate, and it's gonna be hard. But we're interested in doing it. And so while there are people working on talking to landowners about, that project and how we might bring it to fruition someday, the select board said, well, what about that intersection at the Richmond Road, North Road, Texas Hill Road? That's the proposed terminus of this new sidewalk. And we know we have sort of an unconsolidated weird triangle there with some parking and the like. Could we do something to sort of goose this sidewalk project by starting something on that end? And so we prepared a project scope in which we would look at that triangle and decide if there's a way to deal with some safety concerns there, and B, maybe make better use of that, a more efficient use of that triangle area. The Regional Planning Commission agreed to help us with the project. As a result, we hired a consultant that they're paying for. We pay a small local match. They pay the rest of it. And that consultant is essentially coming up with ideas for what we could do there. So we held a local concerns meeting several weeks ago where we invited the community to come and tell us about the intersection and their thoughts. And some people said, it's fine. What are you even studying this for? And other people said, it's a huge safety issue, and I've almost been hit there several times, and, we ought to fix it. And other people said, yeah, there's a safety issue, but it's an easy fix. All you got to do is clear some shrubbery and maybe reduce the speeds, put in a yield sign where we're missing one, and it's fine. So we got a lot of varying input. And so where we are right now is the consultant is developing alternatives. The first alternative is always nothing, just leave it the way it is. And then there are going to be probably 2 or 3 other alternatives of things that could happen there. Our project team is going to discuss that, I think, on the 20th, and then we will hold another public meeting to go over what those alternatives are and to get feedback from people on them. And then the consultant will finalize a report and deliver it to the select board for them to do with what they want.
Who's the project team?
So the project team is Mike Anthony, myself. Who else is on the project team? Let me look at my latest email, John, because we just got the email from the consultant saying, here's the draft stuff. Let's talk about it on the 20th. It has 3 members of the Regional Planning Commission staff. Hold on.
On this project?
Yep. One of them is their GIS mapping person, only because there's some mapping involved, not because she's a transportation expert. The other one is the project manager. So here's the latest message from Julia. Yeah, so at the town level, it's just Mike and myself.
So, as I understand it, then basically this is looking at traffic issues, transportation issues.
Transportation in the full sense. Pedestrians, bicyclists,
Right.
vehicular
Right.
drivers, yes.
All of that. Not necessarily issues that people who live in that area might have beyond transportation areas, such as is there an opportunity for some small
No, that's part of,
Open
those were
space.
part of the,
That
those are some of
actually,
the
yeah, that,
options, so
that was
I'm
part
sure
of the
that'll be
scope
part of
as
the
well.
options.
And there is a landscape architect on the project for the consulting team, because we expressed interest in knowing whether we could do some sort of small parklet in that triangle. And so that they are looking at those options as well. And I just looked at some of the draft alternatives today when they emailed it across, and one of them shows rain gardens and other community art installations there. I don't know if that'll
it'll be
end up-
fun at the next meeting to see what
Yeah,
they've
I don't
come up
know
with.
exactly what will come through to the public meeting. The team may axe or revise some of this stuff, but it does involve a little bit of that.
Okay.
But the principal focus is transportation.
people who live in that area, particularly people who live in the mobile home area there, were some of them at the meeting? Do you know?
Yeah, but I don't know how many people who live in Triple L Mobile Home Park attended. I'm not sure any did. We sent
A bunch from
we
Texas
sent
Hill.
specific mailings to everyone in the neighborhood.
Including
including the mobile home park,
and
yeah.
everybody else scattered around it.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So
Okay.
we did sort of general community outreach on Front Porch Forum and the website, but then we sent specific mailing to those folks. I think we had about 17 or so people at the meeting, and then a similar number submitting comments who couldn't make it, by email. So reasonable, not as many as we had for that Richmond Road sidewalk project where this room was full. We probably had
Yeah, this
30 or
might
40
be a
people.
little more specific
Yeah.
to that area.
But that's the status. We've worked up some alternatives. The team's meeting in the next week, and the next public presentation of those will probably be in April.
Great, good, thank you. Thank
Sure.
you. I had one other thing, can I slip it in? Right now, the Senate is considering a particular bill that has to do with removing the requirements of going through Act 250 on projects that are within, and there may be a legal way to say this, within village areas, within
Yep.
downtown areas. Maybe there's I know there are different designations.
Designated
of this.
village centers. Yep.
Right.
As well. Yep.
And as I understand it, talking to people, hearing from people in the Senate, this is going to really limit the amount of public participation in the process, because Act 250 just goes away in terms of anything that happens in, I think it would apply to our village.
It could apply to our village center designation, which is not the whole village, but is a specific area. If we apply for what they're calling enhanced designation, and they deem our regulations to be adequate, so that the local level review will address, what needs to be addressed. So there would be an additional step we'd have to hurdle we'd have to clear.
But I understand, why would that stop public participation?
It
would
would end Act 250 review.
Right, but they could all come
But
to.
the assumption is that all that public participation would happen at the
in our
local level.
town,
Yeah.
in our board, which to me, I really like that, but maybe you're opposed to it.
Well, I don't
it's
know enough about it
redundant, I
to
think,
really
a lot
take a
of times.
position, but it seems as if there was, by taking Act 250 out, there was some muscle that, to make those rules, people had to abide by those rules, the Act 250 rules. Individual towns got to make their own
Right.
individual rules.
But
So is there,
But sorry. Yeah, but we have such good rules in our town, or we're developing them, that wouldn't it be better to have it handled by our town rather than Act 250?
I
And
don't think
eliminate
it
the
prevents
redundancy.
us from,
No, I'm not saying
With
it
the Act
does, but it would
250
be
in
one
place.
step, not two, not 250 and the town of Hinesburg. Am I right, Alex?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
so the Vermont Planner Association that I do legislative work for is very much all over this thing. So if any, John or anybody else wants the inside scoop,
You can give
talk to me. I can give it to you in great detail. But the general feeling at the legislature, and especially in the governor's office, is that
right, they
we
want
want to green light development in areas
Right.
that have been designated and designed for development,
Yep.
and increase Act 250's sort of oversight in
Other-
everywhere else
Yes,
outside
where
of
they
those
need-
areas.
Really need Act 250, whereas in our town, we're gotta be way above a lot of other towns in Vermont for our process.
Right, and I don't disagree with that at all. You're right. I think we're positioned pretty nicely.
Right, me too.
But I'm thinking about the whole state.
Right.
This is something that applies to all the towns.
so were you
those
gonna
who have
recommend
it.
that people give feedback if they want? And
Yeah,
is there
to
a
the
particular way to
Senate
do that?
committee. And if you go online, I wish I would have written down the Senate number, but there is a
It's-
specific number.
If you look up
217?
H926,
926.
that's the
that's the House.
big Act 250 reform bill that is passed the House and will be considered by Senate Natural Resources Committee probably starting next week. there are a couple other bills, one of which is S-237, that started on the Senate side, that is not a comprehensive Act 250 reform bill. It does some other things, but also
But it
in
has
it is
this
the same sort
piece.
of exemption.
Right.
So there's a couple different bills winding their way through the legislature that have overlap.
What I was told that bill, the second one, in the Senate, is being reviewed right now, being talked about right now.
It is.
And they hope to be able to vote on it Friday.
Yep, that's
Okay.
what I heard too. S-237 is the one John's talking about.
So
Great.
if you have an opinion about it, one way or the other, the implication is you gotta talk to them
Yep.
soon.
Okay,
Yep.
And they'll certainly, you don't have to go and see them. You
No,
can-
I know.
Right.
great.
And that's not in the Senate Natural Resources Committee. That
Right,
bill
that's
is being
it.
discussed in Senate Economic Development. Michael
Alright.
Sirotkin is the chair, and he's a senator from our county. So you should have a direct line to him if you want.
What's the number again?
S-237.
Thank you.
All right, anything else?
Thank you, Maggie.
Okay, if there's nothing else, our next meeting is on March 25th, and the meeting's over. Thanks, everybody.